Hello and welcome to Synthesized Sunsets. Today we have with us Clifford Stumme. Clifford is an entrepreneur and essayist who writes the newsletter Pass the Dragon here on Substack. Pass the Dragon focuses on the goals of fantasy literature and how the genre has changed over time. In particular, it tries to push back against the narrative that escapism is the sole purpose of fantasy, arguing that fantasy can truly enrich our lives in ways that transcend simple hedonism. Clifford, welcome to the show. So the first thing I want to ask you about is your recent article, Eight Eras of Fantasy Literature. For listeners who are unfamiliar with your article and your work, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. First thing I'll say is that it took forever to write. I think there's kind of this bias on Substack against articles that are more than 2,000 words. Everybody's busy, right? So the idiot that I am, I went and wrote a 10,000 word essay trying to basically say here are the different eras of fantasy. Here's how one leads to the other. Here's what they were reacting against. Ever since I, went through grad school and studied literary eras, I was just fascinated by it. Like the idea that a culture at a specific time might say, "Hey, there's this thing we really want to talk about," and these general ideas and feelings that tend to get pushed to the front and kind of characterize that time, like the switch from modernism to postmodernism, or the very strong moralism of the Victorian era, whatnot. And so I said to myself, there's got to be something similar for fantasy. And so I did a bunch of reading and a lot of research, created a few memes, and ended up with, what I feel pretty good about, though definitely not above critique.
Just for the people who haven't read the article, could you give a brief outline of just all of the eras that you mentioned?
Yeah, for sure. So fantasy literary eras, there are 8 of them. First one I'm proposing is the progenitor fantasy, starting with the Epic of Gilgamesh and going all the way to past Beowulf, and right up to about 1100 AD. And this is a time period when there's not really, there's definitely not a genre called fantasy, but there are a lot of fantastical stories being told, and we call it progenitor fantasy because these are stories that would go on to basically form building blocks for what we think of as fantasy and what counts as magical or supernatural, talking about gods and goddesses and, dragons and all this kind of stuff. Then we move into pre-construction fantasy from 1100 to 1760. Pre-construction fantasy is a lot of people taking some of those building blocks from progenitor fantasy and starting to, come up with a few of tropes is maybe the wrong word, but starting to codify some of the expectations for what a fantastical story looks like. This is the time period when we get the court of Arthur, we get Merlin, there's the Fairy Queen, there's the 1001 Nights from Arabia is introduced to Western readers. And we also have this kind of overarching idea of the medieval romance. Then we go into the Gothic era, which lasted from 1760 to 1830. And these stories were maybe fantastical, maybe not. And that's usually the big question in a Gothic novel is are these creepy, weird things happening? Are they real or are they not real? And a lot of times the plot sort of revolves around just figuring out which one of those is true. And the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole in 1764, really started off that genre, and we had this huge level of interest in it up until today, but kind of petered off a little bit in the 1830s, at which point in the 1840s to 1900s, we have the era of fairy. When you read fantasy, people talk like they're sort of old-timey medieval people. It's not quite Middle English. It's definitely not Old English, but it's also not quite Modern English. And that was something that was actually introduced in this time period when people were trying to copy the medievalists. And so you also have a lot of people focusing on fairy, like the land of fairy, where in a lot of Celtic and Irish folk stories, that's where a lot of magic comes from. That's where the fae live, the fairies. Not Tinkerbell fairies, right? But more like the kind of fairies you see in Susanna Clark's Jonathan Norrell and Mr. Strange. Sometimes I get those names mixed up, but that's the basic idea.
Mr. Norrell, yeah.
Jonathan Strange, Mr. Norrell. Yeah, okay, there we go. Thank you. I love that story, but yeah, apparently not. I don't respect it enough to be able to get the names right every single time. So you got the era of fairy, and this was the time period where a lot of the people who would become the fantasy writers, who defined the genre once it actually became a genre in the 30s and 40s, this is when they were growing up and reading stuff. This was when C.S. Lewis, this is when Tolkien were both growing up. and a bunch of other people who started writing in the anti-modern fantasy era, 1900 to 1948. And there's a really big key item here that is super important to any fantasy era. Just about any fantasy era, there's going to be some sort of reaction against mimeticism, or the idea that what matters is what's real and tangible. So if you go back through each of these eras and you look at them, and I don't know if I could one for one every single one, since it's been a little while since I wrote this article, but every era is in some way reacting against the quote unquote real world, and in a lot of cases searching for deeper meaning, whether that's moral meaning or spiritual meaning or philosophic meaning or just personal meaning. And the anti-modern fantasy era is a lot of times it's very anti-scientific. You had a lot of sci-fi that was very popular during this time period that was very pro-science and pro-colonialism, and a lot of the fantasy said no to that kind of stuff and said, you know, instead of having a world where everything's explored and man is taking his dominant role over all of nature, I'd rather live in a place that I don't fully understand, a place that's bigger than me and means something more. And that was a big theme. I think probably a really good picture of that is Bilbo. Like he left. He didn't want to necessarily, but in The Hobbit, he leaves his happy, you know, well taken care of Hobbit hole and goes off to rob a dragon. And I think that's probably like a pretty solid metaphor for most of the fantasy written during this time period. Then we move into the Hinge decade, 1950 to 1958, where you had Tolkien release Lord of the Rings, Lewis release The Chronicles of Narnia, and T.H. White released The Once and Future King. Each of these three works became standards for their genre up until the present day. You had just about everybody influenced by Tolkien, but particularly high in epic fantasy. Children's fantasy and religious fantasy, heavily influenced by the Chronicles of Narnia. You really can't not be influenced by them. And then the Once and Future King, Arthurian fantasy, comic fantasy, and a lot of like social critique or you know, culturally focused fantasy emanates from there. And then only two more left to go. Age of the Heroic Epic, which is a lot of people trying to copy Tolkien for about 40 years, from 1954 to 1999, trying to write epics. And a lot of them not really getting the point of Tolkien or reacting against Tolkien or just trying to straight up copy Tolkien. You really don't have any authors from that time period who wrote epic high fantasy who in some way or another weren't, you know, influenced heavily by what he had done. And it really came to, and especially with the rise of Dungeons and Dragons and a lot of the huge novel series like The Sword of Shannara or Dragonlance Chronicles, you really see what people think of as fantasy becoming that high fantasy. Like it's another world where there's elves and dwarves and men who fight dragons and, you know, have epic quests. And that was just sort of like the norm. And then you have the final one, which is the fantasy diaspora. And this one, honestly, guys, I took a little bit of a creative risk in naming this one because we're still in it. Like it started in 2001 and it is happening around us. And I frankly don't know. Like we might get 20 years from now and move into the next era if we're self-aware enough to figure it out and be like, that wasn't the fantasy diaspora. That was, you know, such and such. But my idea there was basically that the demographics of readers and writers and their different types of interests are being exploded so much. Like before 2000, primary audiences for fantasy literature, young white dudes, basically. Then you move into the 2000s and we've got Romantasy, so women are reading. We've got way bigger emphasis on YA and middle grade, so a lot of those kids are reading instead of just like little kids who are reading, you know, children's lit. Just like a lot of genres that didn't exist before being invented. So that is in a very large and long monologue, apologies for that, the article.
Oh yeah, no worries. Thanks for the summary, Clifford. My first reaction when I read that article was that, it was very thorough. I liked especially how you charted fantasy way back and made these distinctions between genres that a lot of people might not technically classify as fantasy, but are definitely critical to how fantasy came to be what it is today. But the fantasy diaspora thing didn't totally ring true to me. There are ways in which fantasy is diversifying, but I feel like there are even more ways in which it's consolidating. I think that the biggest sign of its consolidation is just Big Five publishing. It used to be that there were all of these interesting independent fantasy imprints, and now they're basically, all being consolidated into the future, like Macmillan Penguin Random House, like giant mega conglomerate.
The singularity.
Yeah, just as like a like kind of a brief funny thing. I was looking up stuff about I believe it was HarperCollins.
Yeah.
And I knew that all of these publishing houses were just giant conglomerates that owned many other publishing houses. What I didn't know is that they themselves are also part of even bigger conglomerates. And I learned that like HarperCollins is owned by the same corporation that owns the Wall Street Journal, and it is called News Corporation. And that just sort of felt like a not real fact.
Well, there you go. Yeah, that's incredible.
But what I've seen is fantasy being motivated by two major trends. The first thing is what I would call new adult fantasy. And I think this is motivated by the massive success of Harry Potter and also Percy Jackson and the Olympians, where you had these massive fantasy series that sold a crap ton of copies to kids of all kinds. Publishers really want to know how they could capitalize on this massive success. Like, how can we get people that bought Harry Potter to buy more stuff? And I think that a lot of the fantasy that is being generated today is trying to appeal to the people who read stuff like Percy Jackson, stuff like Twilight, stuff like Harry Potter in their youth. And I think that's where you see Romantasy come out of. I think that's where you see some parts of cozy fantasy come out of. I also think it's where you see magical school stuff come out of. But I've definitely seen this as a unifying trend, even when superficially some of the books in this genre are not that similar. And I think another trend that I see is publishers trying to capitalize on the mass appeal of games, particularly tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons, and also video games like Baldur's Gate and Assassin's Creed and stuff like that. And I think that I think you saw this especially towards the end of the decade, more and more fantasy trying to emulate some of the qualities of games with like very, very detailed magic systems, very detailed systems that someone who really likes to search for Easter eggs in video games could latch onto. I think that you're kind of seeing these like two demographic blobs. You have the people who are like, were really into Harry Potter and just kind of carried that interest into adulthood, or it was reinvigorated. And then you also have the people who are just like really into Dungeons and Dragons and video games and like Tolkien-esque high fantasy that has now become much harder fantasy. And when I look at the current fantasy landscape, I would classify most people that I see into these blobs. And I would also say that I think that some of the things that used to be like more vital about fantasy seem to have been sanded down. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I know that there's this Ursula K. Le Guin essay called "Why Are Americans Afraid of Dragons?" And it basically explores why Americans who have a particular particular sort of like Puritan go-getter entrepreneurial impulse don't read fantasy because they don't really see it as useful. But I think one thing that's very interesting about this essay is it actually hasn't aged super well in the sense that some of the things she says are just not true anymore. Like one of the things that she says is that a lot of times you just see like random people who don't have a lot of money, like hitchhiking on the road or something, who just happen to be like really, really into like pulpy fantasy. And she describes a very particular type of guy who's just like really into his personal fantasy book of choice and has read it like cover to cover, even though he doesn't have a ton of education or like resources and stuff. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of that has just been kind of vacuumed up by like dopamine traps and stuff like that. Like, I think that type of guy is sort of more of an endangered species now. And so I guess even though fantasy has become more diverse in some ways, I think that there are probably more important ways in which at least the output has been kind of like consolidated. And anyway, I'm curious what you have to say about that.
Well, you have laid out quite the bountiful menu here of topics to choose from. I would say, to go back to the very first thing, talking about the diaspora and the different types of genres. Yeah, I definitely think we've seen a lot of LitRPG pop up in the high fantasy worlds. Sword Art Online was my first introduction to the anime. for that kind of story. And that was pretty cool. Honestly, it was pretty cool for like a couple of seasons, and then I was like, all right, cool. I need something else. I can't just grind all day. But I thought it was cool. And I would contend with you. I think that there are a lot of the tabletop RPG, TTRPG stuff is high fantasy, but I think there's still a healthy level of just straight epic high fantasy that is not in the TTRPG space. I think the Broken Earth by N.K. Jemisin, is it the Broken Earth trilogy, I think?
Yeah.
Like I think that's a really great example of like she's a Black female author. You would not have seen somebody like her be as successful as she has been, and written a novel that got so much acclaim and so much attention back in the 90s. And so I think from a demographic perspective, I would hold that we still have a diasporic kind of result here. But yeah, we might look back 10 years from now and say like, well, the trends that kind of stuck around, the ones that we would really characterize it as, would be new adult and could be TTRPG. I think especially because it's not just the big five, or is it the big four now, that are publishing stuff. Like one of the big things that happened in the early 2000s and late 1990s and into today, actually really started to hit in the 2010s, is self-publishing, where people can just go sell their own stuff. And I think that has led to simultaneously a lot of variety and a lot of sameness, where people kind of see what sells, and they're doing the same thing the big four do, where they say, oh yeah, this vampires are really big right now. I've read so much advice just out of curiosity for self-published authors on Amazon or whatever marketplace they're working with. And usually the advice is, yeah, go see what people are really excited about and then go write some of that, like, and write a novel once a month, and you just got to pump it out. So we see. Oh yeah, and then they're all focused on tropes, right? Where they're saying like, oh yeah, this is enemies to lovers, or this is gets hit on by a billionaire trope, or whatever the case is. And so you see a lot of sameness, but within all of that, if you look hard enough, there is still some diversity.
I will say that one way in which I think fantasy legitimately has had more of a diaspora is when it comes to genre. I think that honestly, fantasy has sort of diversified in a similar way to music, in my opinion. Like you have seen this consolidation of like record labels in the same way that you have consolidation of publishing houses, and there is a lot of sameness. But at the same time, a lot of the divisions that we used to draw between like genres, like, oh, this is R&B and this is hip hop and this is fantasy and this is romance. A lot of these boundaries have started to blur, and the genres have started to bleed into each other. With Broken Earth, which is also my favorite book series in general, I think it's a great example of the worlds of science fiction and fantasy clashing in a way that probably wouldn't have been possible, a couple decades ago. So I think that's definitely a valid point. And I guess especially considering the fact that my next essay is about this particular series defining the 2010s and like not falling into either categories is like a pretty fair point. Something I want to ask you. So you were talking about the fairy era of fantasy being more British. And I was wondering, when you were looking into fantasy literature, to what extent did you see the story of British fantasy and the story of American fantasy being different? And like, do you think they've sort of like merged or drifted apart in recent times? And has there been any pattern that you noticed? I see fantasy as being a little bit more British, whereas I see science fiction as being more American. But I don't know how fair of a characterization you would say that is.
On a surface level, I would say that's a very fair characterization. I think you saw, obviously lots of technological advancement happening in Great Britain, but that's kind of the thing Americans are known for, right? Like inventing things, having really strong copyright laws that allow inventors to go and make things, and then using those things to either hurt or help millions of people all around the world. That is kind of, in a lot of ways, our thing. I think it's funny when I read a fantasy author from Great Britain, it's maybe just some level of personal bias, but sometimes it feels like there's just a little bit more confidence. Like they feel okay to have fun with it. Whereas sometimes when I read American fantasy authors, it's just like so dead serious. Like we're George R. R. Martin and it's grimdark and the world is a terrible place. And we got to make sure that every character's death, really hits the readers hard and all this stuff. But you look at a British author, and there's a lot more satire and a lot more sort of like laughing at all the silliness, and just maybe a little bit less taking yourself seriously. I think that Susanna Clarke is probably a good example of that too, where she goes into writing Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and even to an extent Piranesi, and there's just like a little bit more lightheartedness to it. It's just a little bit sillier. It's a little bit more tongue in cheek. It's a little bit self-aware. And then you look at Ursula K. Le Guin back on our side in America, and like a lot of her stuff is like deadly serious. Like we are looking at social issues, and we are going to make a point here. And I think there's going to be plenty of people who break the exception. This is just my experience.
I don't know if this is an accurate characterization, but I think that fantasy and science fiction were closer together in America than in Great Britain, because in America, they were both relying on the same pulp magazine economy for a while, where you had Lovecraft and Asimov maybe targeting some of the same kinds of magazines, if not the exact same ones. And so in some sense, like Lovecraft feels closer to like Asimov to me in my head than like Tolkien does to Lovecraft, just because like, you know, Tolkien and Asimov and Lovecraft were ultimately like trying to get their work out in the same way, whereas people in Britain were kind of just doing a different thing, and America was really the center of gravity for the magazine economy. And I think as a result, the genres kind of had to merge together in some way. And I wonder if in a way like the rest of the world was pulled along by that.
I think that you're totally right. I think that a lot of times American fantasy and sci-fi was published in the same magazines, stories side by side, and so you're going to see some level of similarity there. And then you're also, whenever you have a medium, you have to attract readers and eyeballs to that medium in a specific way. And with the pulp fantasy or the pulp fantasy, pulp sci-fi, you know, we're having these big scary monsters, you know, these underclothed women being rescued by big space captains with lots of muscles, you know, from whatever sort of aliens out there. And the lines really start to blur between the genres a little bit, because you're trying to attract readers in the same way with the same kinds of things. It's just, instead of a space captain, it's a, you know, a cool knight or a barbarian or something. And this is a time period too when we really had the rise of the space fantasy subgenre, where people basically ride on spaceships or magical transport of some kind, go to another planet in our solar system. So technically it should be sci-fi, but when you get there, everything is freaking weird and it feels a whole lot more like fantasy. I'm actually reading the Voyage to Arcturus right now, and that is probably one of the premier space fantasy novels that sort of define that genre. And it is trippy as heck. Super, super weird. And the whole time you're kind of wondering, like, is this sci-fi? Is this fantasy? I don't know. Well, it's basically the 1930s calling, and they want their you know, weirdness back, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I've never thought about it, but space fantasy might kind of be like a uniquely American institution just because of the circumstance in which it came about.
Yeah, totally could be.
I actually see some parallels to the pulp era and the era today, where I feel like a lot of the online stuff that you find in the depths of like fanfiction.net or Royal Road or AO3 is reminiscent of how people found pulp in the past. You know, there's a lot of it, and a lot of it's really bad. Honestly, the quality might be worse nowadays. But at the same time, yeah. But well, I don't know. I mean, entertainment technology has come a long way since then.
Well, there's fewer gatekeepers, right? And if I can interrupt real quick, I will clarify. David Lindsay, who wrote Arcturus, actually was Scottish. So another point against the stereotype. That's all. Thank you. Carry on.
Wait, Gordon, what were you saying?
Oh, yeah, I was just saying, yeah, I don't know. I feel like your average writer on AO3 is probably like, you know, significantly worse than even the worst of pulp writers.
Okay. Well, I don't know about the worst, but yeah, I guess they weren't getting paid for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so and I think this is almost like a third genre, and I think that you're seeing the beginnings of this starting to institutionalize. I think that one big move into institutionalization was the rise of Webtoon. And just like the general Asian magazine economy. So when I was a kid, I used to read a lot of webcomics. Like I was really into Gunner Craig Court, which is like this British magical school webcomic that's really good. And I read like Order of the Stick, which is like this D&D LitRPG webcomic that's also pretty good. Also, like definitely the target audience is people who play D&D, and I never played D&D, so I don't know why I found it to be compelling. But anyway. I think that, but as I got older, this thing called Webtoon just totally took over, which is this Korean-based company that's more of like a distribution network for various comics on the internet. But the main difference is that because there's institutional backing behind it, authors can actually get paid, but then they're also actually accountable. Like a lot of the times what would happen with the webcomic is that the author would kind of just like get a new job or just like get tired and they're like, sorry guys, like this isn't going to finish ever. And so a lot of my favorite webcomics ever are just like still sitting there on like chapter 5 out of like 24. And I'm just like, wow, well, that was a really good first 20% of a story. I'm sure it would have been really good when it ended. But now with Webtoon, you see that stuff is actually getting finished and artists are actually getting paid, which is cool. But at the same time, I think it does feel a lot more sterile than the Wild West of the webcomic era. And I think something of value was lost. And it's also interesting to see how different monetization strategies are being pursued. Like on Webtoon, you get the first like 20 chapters instantly or something to really get you going. And then after that, you like unlock a chapter every day, or you can like pay more to get a chapter early. It's an attempt to get people to go back to the serialization model by having to wait a week for a chapter artificially and then be able to extract money out of that. Now, one thing that I will be watching, which is interesting, is another venture by the same company called Yonder. And Yonder is basically an attempt to do the same thing, but with actual prose and not just comics.
Oh, really?
So it's like you're getting chapter by chapter prose and you're paying, and it's using the same business model. I have doubts this is going to succeed at all, but I mean, it would be interesting as like an alternative monetization pathway for fantasy authors.
It does kind of feel similar to a lot of web fiction, just in general. Does kind of try to do that monetization strategy. Like it's really common to have, I don't know, just a Patreon or something where you have like your most recent chapters or stuff, and then people who pay into the Patreon get everything, but everyone else has to wait longer. Because a lot of web fictions, they'll come out and then the book will get published, so then you can't like read back. You sort of have to like be in this little narrow window where you're like, okay, I'm not like, if you're not trying to pay money, if you're trying to do it for free, it's like you're not paying for the most recent chapters. You also got to keep reading because, you know, you'll get the old ones will get taken away when it gets actually published as a book.
The hardest part for me is coming across something that has like 48 chapters. You want me to read 48 chapters to catch up and to be in the moment with all the rest of these people? That is asking a lot. 48 chapters is a lot, and each of your chapters are 5,000 words. And so like, what's that, 250,000 words almost? And I don't even know if it's good yet. And I guess like the obvious answer is to say, well, yeah, go read chapter 1 and see if you like it, duh. But for me, part of the excitement is being in the moment and like everybody's waiting for something to drop and we're going to all see what happens and, you know, maybe go to the message boards and talk about it or whatever. And you have, for some of these really long serials, you have to put in so much work to be able to be at the level that everybody else is. And that for me is a little bit intimidating, keeps me from reading more serials than I would otherwise.
Yeah, there's this incredibly long LitRPG web fiction called Wandering In, like millions of words. And I remember at some point, I think it was freshman year of college, I was recommending it to Kevin, and I was like, yeah, well, like the first couple volumes are not too great, but then it like really starts getting good, you know? The first couple volumes are each volume's like 80 chapters, 10,000 word chapters. It's just like the first volume's just a whole Harry Potter series. And I'm like, okay, that volume 4 really starts being good.
That was the thing. I was researching Wandering In, and it was like, oh yeah, you have to get to like book 4 before it really starts to hit me. Or what? No, that's going to take me years. It's like when people tell you about Wheel of Time, where people are like, yeah, book 1 was pretty good. Book 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 kind of, you know, they were just slow and boring. But book 7, man, you got to stick around for that. Like, dude, that is not, like, I could just go read a good book right now instead of putting in all that work.
I think it is a selling point in some sense because it's kind of like a hazing ritual. Like, you know, you got to read, like, you got to spend like months of your life just reading this one thing. And like, you know, by the time you get there, there's all these people waiting there in Discord to be like, so you've come to the end of your journey too, huh? And then you can just be like, yeah. And like, also there's like no one at this point, like you've read this massive thing that like nobody in your life probably cares to talk about. And so you're just like very excited to talk about this really long thing about the only people who can understand. You're just like, yeah. Do you remember at like word number 4 million when like this thing happened? You're like, oh wow, that was so crazy.
Yeah, it's like you become part of the tribe. Like there's a doorway, and once you've crossed the moat, like you are part of the tribe. You're part of a crew. You're part of a, you know, a virtual literary family, and that is pretty exciting.
One of the best points that I thought you made in your Heirs of Fantasy article is predicting that there would be a golden age of satire. And you mentioned Romantasy being a particularly ripe target for satire, but I think you could say the same thing about anime, honestly, or just that entire ecosystem. Really, when you get into like the depths of fanfiction.net and stuff, and also like anime to some extent is just oftentimes like so ridiculous and over the top that it feels like it might be hard to convey that you are satirizing it. So I was wondering, just for the both of you, like, how do you think you could successfully convince someone that the thing that you're writing is satire and not just like a really bad romantasy book?
That is such a brutal put down of anime right there. I don't even know if you intended it that way, but to say, oh man, it'd be hard to satire anime because people would think I was just writing anime. It would be so over the top and overdone. Like that is hilarious, legitimately hilarious. Yeah, Gordon, I'll let you go first on that.
Yeah. So I feel like I've ragged on Romantasy like a bit too much compared to like the fact that I hadn't really read a Romantasy book. So I went ahead and like just recently read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. And yeah, I don't know. It was a pretty interesting experience. She was a pretty good writer and stuff, but it felt like just like purposefully kind of writing what I would normally consider as bad. Like just things were just extremely unsubtle, super obvious what's going to happen the whole time, kind of like and yeah, there were parts of it that just like I was just like, yeah, okay, this is not a satire, but like it feels like a satire. Like every character when they enter gets, you know, a small physical description, and then the male lead shows up for the first time and it's just like 3 pages of like describing everything about his like body and shit. It's just like, okay. But on the other hand, I don't want to hate too hard. Like it was a reasonably entertaining read, and I don't know if I would recommend it, but I wouldn't like not recommend it either. You know, solid 3 out of 5.
Okay, yeah, 3 out of 5. Yeah, I think I really like Mark Twain's approach to satirizing the fantasy of his time period and the sort of the pre-Raphaelite return to medieval romance when he wrote A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, and he basically takes I think a guy from Connecticut who's a foreman at a factory, and just for some reason one day he magically wakes up and he's back in merry old England, and there's King Arthur, and the dude basically just takes over because he's so much smarter and has so much more technological knowledge. And that was a satire of a movement rather than like of a particular genre necessarily. And it was kind of a satire of a lot of assumptions of romanticism. But it's really funny to everybody except for people who really like fantasy, I think, because it's pretty brutal. And they're like, well, that just wasn't any fun. It's just not any fun. But there's a couple of ways to approach the satire. I think that's one, and the other is just to turn everything up to 11 and be like, oh, she got assassinated 7 times. Well, in my satire, people are gonna try to assassinate her like 17 times, and we're just gonna play it again and again until somebody laughs.
I was telling Gordon that I would not be surprised at all if someone set out to write this, you know, very ridiculous, over the top romantasy satire and just ended up becoming a very well liked and beloved romantasy novel. And like now they're getting invited to all of these conferences, like unironically, and having to present their work and just being
Book Talk loves
them. I think it's less about romantasy specifically and more about the cultural environment that we live in now, like the media environment. I feel like the internet has a way of sanding away like all nuance, and like, I don't know, I feel like our brains are kind of getting rotted in a way that like makes it difficult for us to interpret things in like the non-literal ways.
It would require just being like actually a very good writer, right? You just have to write something that's like, okay, this can't be like some random 16-year-old English as a second language writing fan fiction online, like, because it is just like written far too well for that, even if, you know, the things that are happening are like similar to what you would expect in that situation. So I think it would be hard to do as a nobody, but I think it would be doable as an established author.
Yeah, I guess it would be pretty funny if like Brandon Sanderson threw his hat into the ring or something and just wrote like a ridiculous romantasy series. I'd be really curious to see what would happen. I don't think that would be the move for him at all, but like I just really want to see that timeline.
Yeah. I don't know. George R. R. Martin's got to keep doing shit to prolong writing the next Song of Ice and Fire book. Like, who knows?
What if he just satirized his own story? Yeah, that would be perfect. It'd be the perfect way to stall, because you're sort of technically getting a book from the universe, maybe.
Yeah.
So it sort of counts, but also, yeah, I think sometimes satire is a little bit easier to write than like something original. I would say that it's probably harder to write than something that is not original and is just doing tropes and trends. But yeah, if he wanted to, that's a great idea. I love that.
Yeah, maybe we'll get him on the pod and suggest it to him. Speaking of satire, we want to talk about The Beginning Place, which is a book that you wrote about on your Substack. It's a book by Ursula K. Guin. Would you be able to introduce this book to our listeners and how it satirizes some aspects of the fantasy genre?
Yeah, let me put on my professor hat. I'm going to start a lecture here, and I'll keep it semi-brief. I will try, but yeah, this book is amazing, and nobody knows about it. Ursula K. Le Guin, great American sci-fi and fantasy author, best known for A Wizard of Earthsea, which is a children's series. She was very influenced by Lord of the Rings and a lot of the pulp sci-fi and fantasy that we were talking about earlier. But she wrote The Beginning Place, I think in like 1980 or right around there, because she looked around her, saw the fantasy genre as a whole, and was like, guys, you're all just trying to be Lord of the Rings. You're just like copying, and you're just writing these big dumb stories that have no moral resonance with something she was big on. They have no like greater purpose. There's no why. It's just like, here's a dragon, here's a sword, here's a magical artifact. Let's have the good guys and the bad guys do a sword fight. It'll be super cool, right? Let's go on a quest to, get some, thing over there that we need to go get. And so she wrote The Beginning Place to sort of satire how fans interacted with these stories. In this Beginning Place, the Beginning Place is a little, it's like a portal to another world. I think she pronounced it Triumbriazi, something like that. And in this world, it's always evening. It is a fantasy world. There's a evil creature over there or something that's terrorizing the local village. And two humans from our world, through a series of, adventures, find themselves in the Beginning Place, this little creekside wooded area. And they, one of them has already been there before, and the other guy figures out where the village is, and they go there. And they're kind of both using this as an escape from their everyday lives, which really suck. The guy has got this overbearing mom and a dead-end job. The girl's got I think an abusive stepfather and roommates who are splitting up, and then they're going to leave her, and she's kind of stuck. And so they both go to Triumbriazi to escape from that and just to sort of find peace. And it's a metaphor for fantasy literature, because a lot of people use fantasy literature as escapism to say, hey, I don't want to have to think about my problems. I'm just going to put a pause on my problems, go do some fantasy reading, and then, whatever happens, happens. And Ursula K. Le Guin was like, guys, that's not what fantasy is about. Fantasy isn't just escapism. It's not just a piece of candy you eat to try to ignore how sucky your life is. You go to fantasy to find strength. You go there to confront yourself, to see your own weaknesses, the own evil inside of you, the evil in the world. And you come back out of reading fantasy stronger than ever, which, I'll leave the spoilers, but that's kind of the question is, are the characters going to come out of this other world and just go back to their normal lives? Are they going to be better than their normal lives? Are they going to die on the way to try to get back to their normal lives? It's the big thesis statement is basically just, hey, fandom, take a chill pill and let's actually try to grow as people, and treat fantasy as a literary thing rather than as just cheap entertainment.
I read The Beginning Place quite recently, today actually, and it was definitely a very unique book. At least when I was a kid, young adult was honestly kind of taken to mean like high school age. I think this is carried forward into today. Like, I think that the new term in marketing is like new adult, people that are like actually young adults. I don't really know how that definition creep happened, but I was definitely expecting it to be like a young adult book in the sense that the main characters were teenagers or something. And when I opened the book, I was just like, oh snap! Like, these people are actually like 20 and have jobs and stuff, and they're just like working normal jobs. But at the same time, it had the same character arc beats that you might expect from like coming of age story. And I thought that was pretty cool because I think that one deficiency in a lot of our media is that we kind of expect people to hit all of these life beats at the same times. And like, if that doesn't happen, there's a lot of media that's not really going to resonate with you. And there's sort of a failure to market media where you need to have certain life beats to hit. If you're a kid, generally stuff is written for a certain reading ability and also for like a certain level of maturity. And these are like very tightly coupled. But I would say that my reading ability was definitely like above the average for my age. But then I would say that honestly, my social maturity was probably gonna be like a bit lower. And so when my mom would try to get me,
that hits home for sure.
yeah. So like, you know, when my mom tried to get me books, a lot of times they would just be dealing with these themes around like, you know, like themes around like romance and drugs that I was really not ready for, like torture that I was like really not prepared for. And like there weren't really books for like people that are like good readers but are honestly like not all that old. And by the same token, I feel like there's not as much literature for people who are like very mature but like not very strong readers. You know, like it would be hard to find like a genuinely like low reading difficulty book that doesn't just have like very childlike youthful themes. And I think that's kind of sad. So I think it's cool that she wrote a book that was actually for young adults who kind of went through this delayed coming of age process, because I think especially in our modern era, that's a very common phenomenon. Like I think that people are going through these beats at like a later age for various range of reasons I'm not really going to get into. But yeah, so that was the first thing that stood out to me about the book.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, and I think your phrasing of delayed coming of age is very, very apt there, because you're right. They're both in their early 20s, and both of them have problems that they're not dealing with like they should be. They're not facing their problems. So they go into a fantasy world where they're forced to face a problem, and then do they come back with the strength to face their real world problems? Or they overcome? Who knows, right? But the point is that the place that a lot of people can find strength is in the stories they read, and fantasy is a great place to do that.
Yeah, I do also think most young adult novels aren't really targeting like the characters in these books are kind of maturing at a faster rate or like have more independence than actual children do. You know, like your Harry Potters, your Percy Jacksons are just like doing stuff that, you know, normal 13-year-olds aren't doing these things, right? But it's like meant to target the fantasy of like what a 13-year-old boy wish they could be doing, not like what they're actually doing. Where this book was just felt in some ways, it just like felt more in line with kind of like what you would be expecting out of like the life of a 20-year-old who's not going to college or something.
Yeah, they were just such normal, real people. And she talks about that in one of her essays that I would highly recommend to you guys and to anybody reading Science Fiction and Mrs. Brown, where basically she was talking about pulp science fiction and saying pulp science fiction sucks because there's no real characters. There's these like archetypes of like, here's the heroic space captain, here's the damsel in distress. And these like ubermensch go and do their adventures above the heads of the normal people. Where's Mrs. Brown? Where's the lady sitting on the space subway minding her own business doing a crochet? Where's her adventure? What's her life look like? And so you'll see like a lot of Ursula K. Le Guin's work, and Beginning Place is a great example. They focus on just like a normal person and say, hey, normal person in a situation, what do you do? And I think that's a really powerful approach. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, one I remember one scene in the book that I kind of liked was there's this part where the guy kind of just like I forget, like touches Irene, and then I mean, partially because he's trying to be comforting, but also, I don't know, maybe because he's like a bit horny. And then she's just like, don't touch me. And then he's just like, okay, well, now I'm like not going to look behind you to see if you're following me because like, I don't want to care. But then also he's like, but I'm still like definitely listening really hard to make sure that she's following me, but she's not going to know that.
Such good characterization. Le Guin is so good at writing characters. They come to life. They feel like real people. Yeah, it's amazing. And no dragons are bonding with them like in Fourth Wing. Maybe in Earthsea. I don't know. I think the dragons are more bad guys. But yeah, you know, they're just normal people. This Mrs. Brown on the space subway.
Yeah, actually, I think my favorite part of this book, Beginning Place, was like sort of near the beginning where it's just Hugh, who's the main male lead, and he is like discovers this place with this stream and kind of realizes time to really run here. So he's just like, I'm gonna get some camping gear and like, you know, I'll go to my 10 to 6 shift at the grocery store, and then I'll have a whole day and I can just kind of like chill in the woods by the stream and think and and it'll happen like every day in between, and I'll just have to go to work like a lot less and stuff. There's nothing really magical going on outside of just like time not really being spent and stuff. But I think it did like a good job of really like showing this kind of like freedom injected into his life from just even this like very small fantastical thing.
It did remind me a fair bit of A Wizard of Earthsea in the sense that the villain and the struggle that the protagonist was going through was sort of similar. Le Guin was really interested in the ideas of Carl Jung and the idea of people having their own shadow, this dark side of themselves that they have to integrate. And I think that's really just the main theme of both A Wizard of Earthsea and The Beginning Place, where they have this sort of like unknowable villain that resembles their shadow in some kind of abstract way, and they have to find ways to make peace with that and just, you know, come to terms with their inner self in some way. And so it seems like, a theme that she was really interested in caring for with her writing.
Hey, you're totally right. She was really big into Carl Jung, though I don't think she got into him until after Wizard of Earthsea. I think the fact that Wizard of Earthsea, you know, included a main character fighting against a shadow, chasing a shadow, running from a shadow, all this stuff. I think that was actually a little bit more happenstance, and then probably because she was so interested in that topic, Carl Jung made a lot of sense for her. But she was into Carl Jung by the time she came over to The Beginning Place. And yeah, you see the same emphasis there. She talks about Tolkien and how when you look at Lord of the Rings, you got to look for antitheticals. You got to look for characters who are opposed to each other. Frodo against Gollum, Aragorn versus the Ringwraiths, Gandalf versus Saruman, so on and so forth. And she, I think she's maybe oversimplifying Lord of the Rings a little bit when she does this, but she is talking about how in a lot of fantasy there is this fight, good versus evil, and that's one of the core characteristics of what makes fantasy, because it's almost like, she would argue, a Jungian playground for us to go in and fight with the good and bad sides of ourselves. And she's very intellectually honest here when she says that, like, hey, you have to acknowledge that there is the potential for great evil inside of you, just as much as you might acknowledge that there's a potential for great good. And then you go into a fantasy story, and as you're going through, you know, the obstacle course of the narrative, you're getting to see those two sides of yourself interact with each other and see what comes out stronger at the end. And I hope that she's written more about that, because I need to find those essays and understand more of what she's coming at, because I think that's just a fascinating idea. And it's really true to how I've read fantasy as well. I think you go into a story and you start, you know, maybe at a basic elementary level, you're asking, oh, which character do I identify with most? Which one is doing the kinds of things that I would try to do? And, you know, maybe that's a starting point, but it can lead to bigger questions of like, well, what would I do in that situation? Or, you know, do I think that this character acted well or poorly? And it's 1,000 micro decisions and analyses and assessments that you make as you're going through a story that help you to have a more solid understanding of who you are and what you believe.
I want to revisit the Why Americans Are Afraid of Dragons essay a little bit. I know that you wrote an essay about literary pragmatism. One thing that you mentioned is that in order to get the most out of fantasy literature, you can't really go into it being like, okay, I'm reading this book because I'm going to want to get like these things out of it. And this is the attitude that Le Guin attacks in her essay. Is she's basically saying, like, if you're just some CEO and you want to read some fantasy because it'll, you know, tell you how to have the biggest KPI growth in Q3 or something, like you're not going to come away being satisfied. I think the funniest thing that she said was that the other type of book that business people tend to read are the ones that are just very successful, because by reading it, they can sort of surround themselves with the aura of success and like become more successful in themselves by reading things that are successful.
Why would I spend my time reading second best books? No,
yeah, exactly. It's like, or the best books. And I think that particular idea, even though I said that a lot of parts of that essay didn't age particularly well, I think that part of the essay aged really well, because if anything, I think that our media ecosystem, if not like, I don't necessarily know if our like how much our culture encourages it directly, but I just think the incentives around how we consume media and move through life definitely point towards applying a much more like instrumental approach to consuming media of all kinds, including fiction. And so I think increasingly people are like, why should I read a book? Like I can just do more LinkedIn grinding or something. It's going to be more useful
that's
to
what
me.
the K through 12 education system in America teaches us, right? Like everything's always teaching to the test. You don't have people, teachers saying, hey, go read a book because it's fun. Go read a book because you might learn something. They say because you might learn something, but they don't say because you might grow and deepen as a person. No, it's because, hey, we're going to study this paragraph here in the selection from a chapter from this book so that your SAT scores are higher so I don't lose my job. And I think that's one of the central cores. We're teaching kids this super literary pragmatism where the only purpose of reading is literary reading and comprehension. from a super young age. Then we cement it in high school. No wonder we end up with what Le Guin describes as a bunch of business guys walking around, worried more about their stock portfolio than, their own depth of character.
And I do kind of feel like you have to even get the moral growth element, you have to go to it for fun. Like I can't really imagine if you had a 15-minute like moral growth productivity fantasy reading session every morning after your 15-minute morning meditation or whatever, it would be all that effective. It's easy to view your free time or something as something that has to be, is very valuable. Like if you work all day or something, you don't have much free time and stuff, but I think just viewing all your time as stuff to be like divided out to bring these like purposes and stuff. Like I'm going to do this for 1 hour here and do this for another hour, do this for another hour. Like scheduling everything out like that sort of makes the time feel less valuable. And I think if you just view more of engaging with reading or just doing or like watching something or just like going on a hike or playing a sport or just like any activity that you do more in a sense of just like a pursuit of enjoyment directly in doing that thing outside of any sort of consequence, then I think you're more likely to get the type of consequences you want, I guess.
So like avoiding the instinct to like fill your free time.
Yeah, or like
to not think of it in that way. Like you're not filling your free time. You're like being free.
Yeah, you're just like doing the thing you most want to enjoy to do. Now, I mean, I think there's a perspective you could take with that where you just like do that and end up scrolling TikTok for like 4 hours with the 4 hours you have. So if that's like more your issue, I would say this is not advice for you, I guess. But that it might be more of like, okay, set aside an hour to like read something. So I guess it all depends on the type of person you are, but something I noticed for myself, at least, like whenever I'm reading a book I really like, I'm almost always just like, it just eats all of my time pretty much right away. It's pretty rare that there's a book I really like where I'm like, okay, I got to read this, like I'm going to set aside an hour each day. Yeah. It's like, and I feel like this is kind of how books are taught in school. Like pretty much you'll like be reading chapter by chapter or something. Like for me, I read like quite fast, and it's like most of the time if I really like a book, it's rarely lasting more than like 2 or 3 days. And if it's lasting longer than that, it's normally because I'm just like super busy those 2 or 3 days and just like don't have time to read at all.
Or wandering in.
Or it's like lasting multiple months, but is like, eating my first month of college.
One thing that makes me kind of sad is that if you remember getting assigned books in school as a kid, I think it's very common for kids to just be like, I like read ahead and I ended up just like reading the whole book because I liked it so much and stuff. And like, it's very common where the teacher has to be like, don't read ahead, guys, because you have to like make a prediction. And if you read ahead, then you can't make a prediction. But I feel like in high school that would just like rarely happen. Like people are just like, oh gosh, I read this like boring chapter. And like I think it's much less common for teachers to be concerned with people like reading the book. I mean, they'd be delighted that a kid read a book at all instead of going on Spark Notes. So I find that to be kind of sad. And you're an English teacher, right? It's Clifford. So
I have taught English. Yeah, I've taught college English a little bit. Yep, and a few other things.
But yeah, does that kind of resonate with you? Like, did you have the same experience?
I taught mostly like classes that went over short stories. We didn't do much of the longer stuff. And for me, it was a little bit more pulling teeth where you're like, all right, guys, you got to read the short story. You can't get out of it. They were freshmen, right? Like, and it was general education typically. If I was teaching a class full of English majors, yeah, I'd be like, hey, guys, stop reading so many books. I'm going to give you more books to read. And then, obviously that we all know how that would end. They'd read more books. But yeah, in general education, a bunch of kids straight out of high school, basically, you still kind of got to push a little bit.
I think that when you consume media as a kid, it's much more potent and powerful and enjoyable in some ways because you haven't undergone demystification, which is something that you read an essay about. But like, you still see the world as being filled with potential in a way that like like people don't now. And I would say that I considered myself like a fairly rational child. But at the same time, I didn't really have as much information about how the world was. And I would sort of treat fiction as almost like weak evidence. So there's a lot of books where there's just kind of like some secret attic, and they just like, the kids are in their boring house, but then they find this attic and there's just like this magical passageway or staircase to some magical land where they're like a hero or something. And my perspective was, okay, that almost certainly doesn't happen. But I mean, it's not like the world that they live the world they live in is incompatible with the world I live in. Like, in this universe also, it's like a thing that parents don't consider to be a thing that can happen. And also, all these different authors are writing about this thing. So obviously it's a thing that many people have reported on. So I don't know, I'd give it maybe like a 1% chance there could be like a secret room in my staircase or a secret room in my attic or something. And so I remember there was this one time where, so in my childhood house, there isn't really a conventional attic, but because of the way that they built the house, there's sort of like this triangular space above the ceiling, like on the upstairs, where sometimes like bugs would come in there from stuff, and sometimes we'd have like problems. And there's also just like this kind of weird vent passage that like goes up in there. And I remember like one time I saw a fly down from this passage space, like through a light bulb socket. And I was just like saying like, hey, you know what? Like, we should just check out this attic, like just in case, to see if there's like a magical rainbow staircase or something. And then I was trying to like convince my dad to let me go up there just to see if there's like a magical rainbow staircase in case there was. And like, he was saying like, no, we're not going to do that. Like, you would have to like saw a hole in the ceiling, and it's just like utterly ridiculous. But like, from my perspective, and it's like from his perspective, I was being like totally irrational. But from my perspective, he was being totally rational, because I don't know, there's like a 1% chance you go to magical fantasy land, then like I would like cut a hole in the freaking attic space.
Yeah,
so
sure, Dad. Come on, what are you thinking? Your dad's thinking to himself, but son, this isn't an old English manor that's been around for 200 years. Our odds, this is an American built house from the last 40 years. Like the odds are astronomical. In a British manor, the odds are like 3% at least.
But like, I think that that's like a thing that weakens our consumption of media as adults, is like, I think that we really, really have fully closed ourselves off to distant possibilities. And I think the difference between seeing something as like an unlikely event and like an impossible event is huge. And I think that because we are so certain about certain things, we actually do reduce them down to impossible, even though that's maybe not the most rational approach. Like, I feel like there's a lot of things where we should consider them to have like a 0.00001% chance of happening, even though in our brains, because we can't really think of things that way, we just think of them as impossible. And I think that once you think that way about
it's very unlikely that there's a magical portal in my attic.
It could be
but it's not
possible.
like, you don't know it's impossible. You don't know that. You don't know everything. Come on.
Right. And so I think that's the advantage that a lot of fantastical narratives have for children, is you don't think like, oh, this could plausibly happen once you're a certain age, but you think like, oh, well, maybe this could happen. You haven't really like been like, oh, the world is this way, the world is this way, in a way that adults are. And so I think that, as you mentioned in your article about demystification, I think that there is a role for fantasy in like, I think that fantasy maybe doesn't like make you think like, oh, well, maybe this thing could be possible. Maybe sci-fi does, but conceptual barriers of the possible that are maybe less concrete. Like, it could be possible for your life to go a certain way. It kind of breaks you out of the whole like nothing ever happens mindset.
And that goes back to Why Americans Are Afraid of Dragons by Ursula K, right, her essay, where she's talking about imagination. And what you're describing right there, considering the possible, and coming up with ideas for what could be possible, that's basically the nuts and bolts of imagination. What she was complaining about is a lot of people have sort of let imagination go. We're going to deal with facts and figures and numbers. And instead of our imaginations coming up with something creative or cool, expressing ourselves, helping us to interact with the world in a deeper way, we use our imaginations. And she didn't even go this far, I think, but she might in a different essay. We use our imaginations to think about, what if I had more money? What if I, had a bigger house? What if I was more successful? And that's kind of a sad use of the imagination when you think about it, especially when you compare it to Kid You thinking about, magical fairy rainbows, going to other worlds where you get to be a hero. Like, gosh, it reminds me a lot of Puddleglum from The Silver Chair and the Chronicles of Narnia, where he's talking to the witch at the bottom, and he's like, you know what? Even if there's not an Aslan, even if there's no such thing as the sun or the above ground, I would sure as heck rather believe in that than this sucky world that you've made down here. Like, this is the worst. I'm going to go and be delusional before I, agree to this. Come on.
If you hold out some kind of hope or like small, tiny possibility for like, the more fantastical, whatever magical things, then, if you're believing there's a 0.0001, whatever, rather than impossible chance of a magical portal opening up, suddenly like, getting a different job or something is like much easier to think of as a very possible thing than an impossibility, right?
Yeah, it raises hope, right? It gives you hope.
As a final note on Le Guin and imagination, I wanted to talk a little bit about her article, The Stalin and the Soul. Could you introduce that essay for our listeners?
Yeah, The Stalin and the Soul is a critique of writing to market. She talks about a Russian author whose name I do not know how to pronounce. Zamyatin, I believe. Yep, Zamyan. Okay, I actually did it. He wrote one of the original dystopians that sort of inspired 1984 and most other dystopians out there that have been written since. And that book was called We, and it was an indictment of Russian society and communism. And she basically said, look, guys, if he had been trying to sell something, if he had been trying to write a book that was going to make him rich or help him, put food on the table, he would have never, ever written that book. He would have said, no, thank you. I'm going to write some puff piece talking about how great Stalin is. I'm going to make $100. And she says that there's different types of censorship. There's censorship by government, to try to suppress movements or truth. And then there is the suppression of the market where we say, hey, I want to be able to be rich and famous, or I want to be able to make some money. It's really important to me to be a professional writer. And so I'm just going to write what the people want, and I'm going to give that to them. And she basically is arguing that that's really sad. She says that that is essentially an approach to art that reduces its power because you're not willing to make sacrifices for the sake of your artistic vision, your art, your message. And it keeps what you write from ever really being able to hit home with people. Now, I guess that's not to say that it keeps you from never hitting home 100% of the time. But I think Ursula K. Le Guin would say that the most important thing when you're writing something is to have some moral resonance to it. Now, obviously, you got to entertain people. That's part of writing a story, right? It's got to be entertaining, even if it's not happy entertaining. Maybe it's cathartic entertaining. But you have to write something that is true. You have to be honest with yourself, write the thing you actually want to write. Because she gives an example of an American author who was like, I've got this great big novel I want to write. It'll be so cool. And then he gets hired to go and write, ghost write some stuff for a while. He gets used to the money and he forgets that novel and never writes anything of lasting importance. Everything he writes is forgotten as soon as somebody reads it. And then he writes the next installment in the series, and then they read that and forget that. And I think her big thing, she's just saying, that's a pretty sad way to live as a writer when the potential for writers is so high. This ability to be like Kazam and to write something that had so much power and so much impact, influenced the genre, influenced readers, influenced Russia as a whole, and really made a difference.
Yeah, sort of going off that. I mean, I think it's worth like realizing that having markets and stuff is obviously preferable and gives you way more freedom than if you're like literally in the Soviet Union and writing something that, goes the wrong way. You have like a legitimate chance of dying. And it's kind of easy to lionize someone who goes against that, but it's also easy to like sympathize with writers who maybe didn't risk their life as well in that situation. But if you have a lot more power, like in America, maybe you have some 1,400 page, like unapproachable monstrosity to the vast majority of people. And maybe it's fine that you shouldn't write that. And like, there is some advantage to writing something that people in general like is probably good. But at the same time, you don't have to be 100% exactly what's going to be like the most consumable, marketable thing. And you can find some compromise between that artistic vision and what's going to make the most money. And that's probably, will be more lasting and be more valuable for you as well.
It goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning with the big four and how sometimes some subgenres of fantasy start to look very, very similar. I mean, it's the same with self-publishing where people go on to Amazon Kindle and they're like, oh, what's selling? Okay, cool. I'll write one of those. Like, oh my goodness, that sounds soul-sucking to me. Why are you just going to go copy what somebody else is doing? There's no originality in that. There's no risk. There's no adventure. There's no bravery in that, right? And there is value in entertainment, but it's a whole lot less than people think. That sort of cheap escapism, that opportunity to turn your brain off and narcotize for a while with a story that doesn't mean anything. Sure, I'll take advantage of that every once in a while too. That's a part of life. But the problem we get into as consumers is when we think that that's the main function of narrative and stories, instead of putting where it should be as maybe a little bit of an appetizer, before we get into the main course. And I think Ursula K. Le Guin is a main course kind of writer. And while I don't think it's wrong to write appetizers, I think it's sad to miss out on going deeper as a reader and as a writer.
Yeah. Besides the obvious, just things becoming more samey, are there any particular ways that you feel like people are self-censoring to more appeal to the taste of the general public or the whims of the market?
I feel like it's pretty common to have a protagonist that just doesn't really make any moral choices. Like if you write your protagonist to be like very self-inserty and just vaguely good and doesn't really have to like make moral like sacrifices or make tough decisions because all of the difficult stuff is kind of taken care of by just like the situation they're placed in. So then like any reader of the book can imagine themselves as that character and making all the decisions of that character and then be like, wow, I'm such a good person. Like I would do the same thing and save the world. And it's like, well, yeah, because like you didn't like actually like this character just like got gifted a lot of power and didn't actually make any decisions with it outside of just like, I don't want like everyone in the world to die.
Dude, that is awesome. That is an awesome description. I was reading a novel recently. It was Robin Hobb's first trilogy, Royal Assassin, The Assassin's Apprentice, the Farseer trilogy, where like the main characters is exactly what you described. And I did end up finishing the first two books in the series, but I don't know if I'll ever read the third because the guy is so passive. And he just doesn't try to screw people over, and he does what the good guys tell him to do. But you're always like, come on, man, don't you actually like, want anything? Like, can't you make something happen? Like, I feel like you're just like a vehicle for me to watch other people do interesting things. Like, I'd rather the book be from literally any other character's perspective. But, yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good time to wrap things up. Thanks so much, Clifford, for coming on the podcast. And as a final note, is there anything you would like to plug and a short fiction recommendation that you would like to make?
Yeah, Pass the Dragon is my Substack. We do long form literary essays about fantasy, mostly. Just kind of having fun with it, seeing what's out there. Try to be a little provocative and follow through on the promises of the titles. I think the 8 genres and then the 100 most influential fantasy novels from those genres is another one I did recently that I think is pretty fun. Those are all good. And then a short story I would recommend, Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. It's a great miniature version of what she's capable of in a novel. And then The Shadow, which was a collab with a guy whose name I don't know, and Hans Christian Andersen, who I believe Ursula K. Le Guin really, really enjoyed. And it's a creepy, weird, crazy fairy tale where a shadow basically takes over the real person and makes him his servant, I guess. But it's more complicated than that, and it's very eerie and interesting.
Clifford, it was great to have you. Thanks again for coming on, and we'll see you all next week.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys.